4 parallel gashes ran floor to ceiling across the limestone wall of a flooded cave off northern Palawan, each one deep enough that his dive light dropped into the groove and never bounced back out. And the graduate student running his light along them counted them twice before he trusted the number. Cole Bennett had been diving with Dr. Renata Saul for 2 seasons, long enough to know her flashlight never shook. It was shaking now, tracing the same 4 lines up toward the ceiling, where they simply kept going, past the beam's reach, into a section of cave neither of them had ever mapped. Neither diver spoke on the comm line for 11 seconds. Then Renata's voice came through, flat and careful in the exact way she got right before telling him something he wouldn't want to hear. Picture holding a dive light perfectly steady on 4 lines that keep going past where your own beam can reach, and not being able to look away long enough to check your air. Whatever made these had done it more than once. Some of the grooves had the smooth, worn edges of old scarring. Others cut sharp and fresh, as if the same 4 points had pressed into that stretch of rock again and again, at intervals long enough for the older gouges to weather before the next pass carved new ones beside them. Cole's dive computer chirped a proximity warning it had never once triggered on this site before, flagging a mass entering the cave mouth behind them. For a moment, neither of them moved. That proximity alert is the reason this dive's footage got flagged for review by the university's safety office within 48 hours. And it's the reason Renata is finally willing to explain the paper that quietly ended her academic career 15 years before Cole ever met her. She didn't tell him any of that underwater. She had a much more immediate problem. The mass on Cole's screen held steady at the cave mouth, not advancing, not retreating, close enough that both their exhaust bubbles briefly changed direction. Renata killed her primary light on instinct, leaving only the dim backup glow, and motioned for Cole to do the same. Whatever was out there didn't seem to need to see them to know exactly where they were. It held that position for nearly a full minute before the proximity reading finally dropped off Cole's screen, and by the time they surfaced 20 minutes later, neither of them had said another word about it out loud. Before we get into what that thing at the cave mouth actually was, and how Renata already half suspected the answer 15 years before she ever set foot in this particular cave, hit subscribe. Because the reason nobody believed her the first time is the same reason almost nobody's looked closely enough to find this since. 15 years ago, Renata proposed something at a regional marine geology conference that got her laughed at, not argued with, laughed at, from the second row back. Her theory was simple. Certain large marine predators might use submerged karst caves, the way some sharks use reefs, as fixed, repeat visited sites, not random hunting grounds. Even now, she says she can still hear the exact pitch that laughter took. Polite at first, curdling fast once the first person in the back row said the word Nessie loud enough for the room to catch it. That laugh had a name attached to it. A senior colleague named Desmond Farrow, 2 seats over from the department chair, was the one who said it, and he made a point of repeating the joke at the conference dinner that night, loud enough that Renata heard it secondhand from 3 different people before she'd even finished her drink. The paper never got published. The funding attached to it evaporated within a month, routed instead to a survey proposal of Farrow's that covered almost the exact same stretch of coastline. Renata spent the next decade teaching adjunct courses and chasing smaller grants further and further from the idea that had ended her tenure track before it began, until a promising graduate student with a cave diving certification and no idea about any of that history asked to join her on a routine karst mapping survey off Palawan. Cole didn't know why she went quiet for a second when he mentioned the site coordinates. He knows now. Back on the boat, Renata pulled up the dive footage frame by frame, past the gouges, past the proximity spike, until she found 4 seconds of grainy motion at the very edge of the frame she'd somehow missed live. A shape, low and dark, pressed close against the cave wall exactly where the gouges started. It wasn't moving toward the camera. It was moving along the wall, deliberately, the same worn path the older scarring already traced. What do you call evidence that gets more convincing every single time someone tries to wave it off as nothing? Cole spotted something in that same frame Renata's eye had skipped past twice. A second set of marks, lower on the wall, shallower, spaced closer together, sized for something smaller. 2 animals, not 1. Renata didn't sleep that night. She kept replaying 4 seconds of footage until the boat's generator ran low, trying to decide whether what she was looking at was a hunting ground, a nesting site, or something closer to a school, a place one generation apparently returns to teach the next. Cole asked the obvious question first, the one Renata had already been circling for hours without saying it out loud. If the smaller set of marks belonged to something still learning, that meant whatever they'd found wasn't just surviving down here in isolation. It meant continuity. A parent teaching a specific, repeatable behavior to something small enough to still need teaching it. That single distinction was the entire argument Pharaoh had laughed out of a conference room 15 years earlier, reduced now to 2 sets of scratches on a wall neither of them could stop staring at. Renata made herself say the hard part first, before Cole could ask her to soften it. Gouges that wide, spaced that precisely, point to exactly one known species, and the fossil record is unambiguous about when that species vanished, long before anything resembling a human being ever stood on a shoreline anywhere on Earth. She isn't trying to overturn that timeline. Decades of fossil work back it, and 4 scratches in a limestone wall don't erase a body of evidence that size. Renata has never once argued otherwise, and she says the people who mock her haven't actually read what she wrote 15 years ago. What that fossil record doesn't account for is where anyone's actually looked. Nearly every specimen ever pulled from the ground came out of shallow coastal sediment, riverbeds, places a person can reach without specialized gear. Flooded karst systems like this one sit almost entirely outside that record, not because there's nothing down here, but because almost nobody with the right equipment and the right nerve has ever gone looking this deep inside one. A gap in the fossil record isn't the same thing as a gap in what's still down here. On their second dive into the passage, Cole found something wedged into a crevice near the base of the larger set of marks, half buried in silt. A tooth fragment, broken at the root, longer than his palm. 4 centimeters is the average width of a modern great white's largest recorded tooth. The fragment Cole photographed in place, then carefully freed, measured nearly 3 times that at the base alone. Renata didn't touch it until she'd shot it from 6 different angles exactly where it lay. She'd learned that lesson the hard way 15 years ago, the first time she handed over evidence without documenting it herself first, and watched someone else's lab quietly lose track of it. That earlier specimen was smaller, a chipped fragment recovered from a shallow reef survey, nothing close to what Cole had just pulled from the silt. She'd logged it, bagged it, and handed it to Pharaoh's own department for cataloging, the standard procedure at the time. It never appeared in any collections inventory again, and when she asked about it 2 years later, the answer she got was that the record must have been misfiled during an office move. Cole didn't know any of that yet, kneeling in the silt with a fragment 3 times the size of the one that had already cost his advisor a career once. He only knew that Renata's hands, steady on every dive he'd ever logged with her, weren't steady now. The university's safety office reviewed the proximity footage within the week and issued a written directive rather than a phone call. All further dives into that passage were suspended pending a full risk assessment, and the tooth fragment was to be surrendered to the biology department's collections office for proper identification. Renata read that directive twice. Then she photographed the fragment 11 more times before she handed it over, because she already knew exactly how quickly evidence like this had a way of becoming unavailable for independent review. She wasn't wrong to worry. A local dive tourism operator named Trina Munoz had already inquired about the site's coordinates that same week, hoping to add a marketable cave system to a company brochure, and the department's collections office suddenly seemed a great deal more interested in accommodating Munoz's calls than in returning Renata's. Renata called the collections office 4 times over the following 2 weeks. The first call, she got a receptionist who promised a call back within the day. The second and third calls, she got voicemail. The fourth time, someone finally picked up and told her politely that the fragment's paperwork had been routed to a different reviewing committee and that Renata would simply need to wait for that committee's own timeline. Nobody on that committee, as far as Renata could determine, had a background in marine vertebrate identification. Pharaoh did. A cover-up doesn't need a locked room or a memo nobody signs. Sometimes it just needs everyone involved to be quietly, plausibly busy for exactly as long as it takes a grant cycle to run out on its own. If you're finding that as maddening as Renata clearly did, watching the same slow erosion happen to her twice, go ahead and subscribe, because what she did next is not something the university safety office approved. Renata used her own remaining discretionary funds to have the fragment independently scanned before it ever reached the collections office, working with a private lab willing to move fast and stay quiet. The scan confirmed collagen still present in the root structure, not fossilized, not mineral straight through, recent in the way that only something still biologically active could be. Cole asked her straight out whether she was about to lose her job over this a second time. Her answer wasn't reassuring. It was honest. Maybe. But she'd already lost 15 years to staying quiet the first time, and she wasn't interested in losing this decade the same way. They went back into that passage one final time, off the books. On a weekend the university's dive log conveniently forgot to note. With a second camera, Cole rigged himself from spare parts so there'd be a copy nobody's collections office could misplace. They found both sets of marks again, exactly where they'd left them. This time, they waited. 30 minutes in, Cole's hand found Renata's wrist in the dark. Not to warn her, just to stay close, and neither of them let go for the rest of the dive. 40 minutes into the dive, the smaller shape came first, low and pale against the rock, tracing its own shallow groove into the wall with slow, deliberate passes, in no more hurry than anything that has never once needed to check over its own shoulder. The larger shape followed less than a minute later, close enough behind that for a moment both shapes occupied the same narrow stretch of passage, moving in loose, unbothered parallel. Neither one so much as turned toward the two divers holding perfectly still against the opposite wall. For a moment, the beam of Cole's backup light caught the larger shape's flank, and the texture there wasn't smooth. It was scarred, old white lines crossing older white lines, a lifetime of passes through the same narrow rock. Renata has said since that the fear she expected to feel simply never arrived. What she felt instead, watching two shapes work the same patch of rock a generation apart, was something closer to recognition. That's the part the safety office's report will never capture, because it was never designed to measure it. When Renata finally submitted her formal findings, colleagues who'd sat in that conference room 15 years earlier started quietly requesting a copy of her old rejected paper for the first time since it was written. Farrow was not one of them. He has not responded to Renata's findings publicly at all, and the department's collections office never did produce a written explanation for the 4 unreturned calls. Nobody has publicly apologized. She says she stopped waiting for that particular kindness a long time ago. What she didn't stop waiting for was someone to finally believe Cole, too, on his very first real find instead of making him wait 15 years the way she had. She listed him as first author. The exact coordinates of that passage still aren't in any published paper. Renata and Cole made that decision together over the tourism operator's repeated calls, because the one thing worse than nobody believing you is everybody believing you for the wrong reasons, and showing up with cameras and boat engines before anyone's finished asking what that cave actually means to whatever still uses it. Cole has already started drafting a second paper of his own, this one on the teaching behavior itself, and Renata has told him more than once that she isn't going to let a first-year graduate student make the same mistake she made and present it to a room before the evidence is airtight enough that nobody gets to laugh. If someone ever laughed you out of a room for being right too early, tell us about it in the comments below, because Renata Saul waited 15 years for someone to say she wasn't imagining things. And if you want more accounts pulled straight up from the deep, subscribe, because somewhere off Palawan, 2 generations of something are still teaching each other exactly which wall to come back to.